It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
We absolutely believe that net migration has to come down, but in order to do that, we need to go further.
These numbers are still far, far too high. We need a hard cap on numbers.
Net migration has come down, but last year's figure has been revised up to more than 900,000. What's going on?
I'm really clear. I'm not coming back with more borrowing or more taxes.
The Prime Minister is asked to repeat his Chancellor's pledge, but says this.
I'm not going to write the next 5 years of budgets here at this dispatch box.
So, did the Chancellor mean what she said? And just 24 hours for MPs to decide how to vote on the assisted dying bill. Joining us today, Conservative MP Dr Neil Shastri-Hurst, Labour MP Rachel Maskell, Co-op Group CEO Shireen Corey-Hack and Telegraph columnist Tim Stanley. This is Politics Live. And we start today with the breaking figures on immigration numbers. They have been released by the Office for National Statistics. These are published twice a year and they look at the numbers of people leaving and coming to the country. Here is the BBC headline from this morning. Net migration to the UK hit record 600,000 in the year to June 2023. So, my question to the panel. First of all, Neil, is immigration too high in your view?
It is too high, and I think that's not an uncontroversial position to take. We've heard from both the government and from the Conservative Party today. These figures are too high. We need to have a robust policy to tackle them, and we need to bring them down because if they maintain at this level, it's going to be unsustainable in terms of public services and demands on our infrastructure.
Rachel, do you agree it's unsustainable, these figures?
Well, it's quadrupled over the time the Tories have been in government, and clearly we do need to address those figures. But I think what's most concerning is the fact that small boat crossings have continued to rise, 14% up last year. And of course, we know that every person that comes over, that's a life put at risk. And being able to control those borders is really important, those borders in France, to stop that smuggling of people into those boats to come to the UK.
Shireen, as a big employer, are you concerned about these immigration figures?
Well, look, I'm responding as an immigrant myself. I came here 23 years ago from the United States and Australia before that. I think if you ask me or any other business leader, we will tell you that we have essential skill gaps and labour shortages in specific areas. So we can work with government to help identify those because we do need additional people. However, I think the important thing to note is when they do come here, we need to be able to help them to be productive, and we need to help welcome them as I was welcomed in this country so that they can contribute to our country as much as they can.
OK. And Tim, it's been a huge political issue, hasn't it, the immigration figures? What do you make of these?
It's simply not good enough for the Conservatives to say that it's too high when they've been in charge for 14 years. I'm old enough to remember when the Conservatives pledged to limit it to the tens of thousands, and when right-wing newspapers like mine were having kittens at it running at about 300,000. Well, now it's been approaching 1 million. There was always a nervousness about discussing immigration because people didn't want to come across as racist. But now, as time's gone by, we can see what it is a numbers problem. Of that vast figure that came in up to the year June 2023, according to the ONS, 86% were from outside the EU. So we voted to leave the EU in order to regain control of our borders. And what did the Tories do? They opened those borders from people outside of the EU. As for the issue of, well, OK, it's a lot of people, but we need them to do jobs. Well, and I'm quoting the ONS here, for that up to June 2023 figure, 29% of the non-EU arrivals were for study. 23% were work dependents, as in they were people who had come with someone seeking a job. So a significant proportion of those arriving are not, in a sense, adding net to the economy. They are actually taking away. So I'm afraid the arguments, be it we mustn't talk about this because it's racist, or the argument that we need this because we need it for the economy, they're not sustainable. Britain, for some peculiar reason, has just been accepting vast numbers of people it cannot afford to take.
Well, we will discuss all that again in more detail in a minute, but for now, let's just talk to Madeleine Sumption. We're joined by her from the Migration Observatory at Oxford University. There's an awful lot in these figures to get through, including a large revision up of previous figures. Madeleine, can you just give us a sense of what we've learned today?
Yeah, I mean, the most surprising thing, I think, in the statistics is this upwards revision that we've seen to previous years, which results basically, well, partly from the fact that there were quite a few Ukrainians who had been missed in the previous statistics. They've now been added back in. And the ONS also has more complete data. So we're getting a better picture of what migration was actually likely to have been in that period. Now, we see the beginning of a downward trajectory, which seems to mostly result from the policy restrictions brought in by the previous Conservative government between the end of last year and April this year.
Now, within those figures, the figure of 900,000, and as we're saying here, this is net migration. What is that made up of? Who are the people coming to this country?
Well, the biggest two categories of migration over the last couple of years, the 900,000 was for the previous year. We're down at just over 700,000 for the most recent period. And workers and students are the two big categories there. That's included quite a lot of people coming to work in the care sector, although those numbers more recently have been trending downwards. And international students, we saw a big increase in students coming from India and Nigeria in particular, and in family members coming with those students. Again, the most recent figures are showing a decline, including quite a big drop over the summer in Nigerian students coming to the UK.
We have had this large, significant revision up of the figures. Are you surprised about how far out they've been? And do you have any explanation for why?
Yes, I am surprised. I think if you look back to the figures that were published in 2000 for the calendar year 2002, those have now been revised 3 times, and the original figure was around 600,000. The latest figure is now above 800,000 for that 2022 year. And I think some of the things very difficult to have foreseen. The fact that some Ukrainians seem to have got lost in the statistics, for example, have now been added back in, and there have been some improvements to the methods over time that mean ONS is catching more people. I think so. My hope is that we will settle down into a more stable situation where we're not seeing these big swings in the revisions. It is inevitable that there will always be some revisions, because in order to publish the data in a timely manner, the Office of National Statistics need to make some assumptions about how likely people are to stay, and those don't always turn out to be right.
We've heard a lot of politicians talk about getting the numbers down. Are there policies that you can identify that might do that? I mean, we have seen some changes already, haven't we, brought in by the last Conservative government?
Yeah, so the changes that have had the most impact from the last Conservative government are most likely, particularly in the medium term, to be the reduction in the number of care workers. Of course, that's a partial reversal of a liberalisation that the Conservative government introduced, and also the restriction on students. I think going forward, if we'll likely see some continued decrease in the figures, although not necessarily to particularly low levels. We could well remain above the pre-Brexit levels even after we see the full impact of the policy changes. And I think probably that one of the biggest, most difficult conversations to have for those who want to see further reductions in migration is what's going on in the care sector. Even though the numbers have decreased, they're still quite significant, and that has been a major driver of migration to the UK in the last few years.
Okay, Madeleine Sumption, thank you very much for unpacking some of those figures for us. Neil, if I can just turn to you. I mean, the Conservative record on this, for a party that under David Cameron talked about the tens of thousands, I mean, the revision up is much more than the tens of thousands. I mean, what do you say about your record in government?
Well, I think there are two things. Firstly, we have seen some reductions because of the policies that were set out by the last government at the back end of last year. So there is progress being made. But clearly, the figures are not good enough. And this has been a failure of successive governments, both Conservative and Labour. And Kemi came out and said that yesterday. She was very honest with the British people that if we want to regain their trust, we need to deliver on our promises. We can't make statements about reducing net immigration into this country and then not deliver upon it. And very sensibly, she is going away and thinking through that policy so that when we next go...
Yeah, but if you look at your record here, if you look back at Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, the points-based system, many people would say, actually, that was incredibly generous. You were saying one thing, but actually the policies being brought in were pretty liberal.
And I'm not disputing that. We didn't get this right. I'm holding our hands up. We didn't get this right as a party. I think politics generally across the political divide haven't tackled this issue as we should have done. I'm the son of a migrant. My father came here from India in the 1970s and he integrated into society and he made a good contribution. But we've got to make sure that we get the balance right. Clearly the numbers that we've seen today are way outside what is a sustainable and acceptable level. But we've got to be honest, and as a party, as a Conservative party, I think we're taking the right approach with looking introspectively, looking where we got things wrong, and coming forward in the months and years ahead with a robust set of policies that will tackle this issue.
So, Rachel, now obviously this becomes the Labour government's issue, and Labour too saying they want to bring the numbers down. Do you think they should come down, and if so, how?
Well, we've got to look at the economy skill gap across the board, but also I do want to take issue with the point that Tim Stanley was making regarding education, because the reality is we know that international students put into our country, they keep universities, finances viable at this time. So we've got to look at the positive contribution that students can make, but also people that work. We know that from when I was on the Health and Social Care Select Committee, we did an inquiry in looking at what was happening in the care sector. There was no consultation. And of course, we're seeing those numbers fall. When we've got a skills gap in the care sector, we can't move people out of hospital fast enough. So in the most expensive part of the NHS, into the community, back home, because we haven't got the workforce there. So we've got to get the balances right. And I think part of the solution lies also in what Liz Kendall was saying at the start of the week with the Get Britain Working programme that we're putting forward, getting those 2.8 million people back into work again, helping support people so we have the right skill set for the future. And then places like the NHS aren't fishing around the world to try and find staff to support those services.
Tim, do you want to come back on that? Sure. The idea of students, I mean, students make an incredibly positive contribution. Shouldn't that be celebrated?
They can and they can't. I mean, in some cases, student visas have been a means to get into the country by doing a course of very low value, which is quite easy to get onto. And it supports a university sector which is bloated and has just become a cash cow. I mean, we thought universities were about educating and skilling people, but increasingly they're just a business, really. And also they have been bringing dependents. So I would say that my point is that when
that's
one of the changes the Tories make. But when mass migration is sold to us, my point is, it's always been sold to us as, well, it's plumbers, builders and care workers. But my point is if you look at those figures, no, it's really not. That is not that's not the vast majority of what are the people who are coming in. Now, in the case of the care sector's been raised, what we should have been doing all these years is raising the wages of care sector workers. We haven't been able to do that because central government, under the Tories, I'm sorry to say, starved local authorities of cash, which meant they weren't able to invest in social care. So how do we plug that gap? We bring in cheap migrants from overseas. And this is the problem, is Britain has a model in its economy of paying people low wages, having a flexible labour market where it's easy to hire and fire. And there are advantages to that. It's one reason why we've run a low unemployment rate. But the downside is that people aren't upskilled, they're paid low wages, and bosses are able to get around that by just importing the labour that they can't get from British workers.
OK, Shireen, we have a boss here.
Have been going on to benefits.
What's your experience of hiring, particularly those coming from abroad?
Oh, well, we certainly pay them a fair wage, so I want to make that absolutely clear. 10% of our workforce are not British, and we're absolutely dependent on ensuring that every single one of our colleagues is productive, whether they are migrants or whether they are British nationals, whether they're second generation or whether they're multi-generational. And I think that's the bit I really want to focus on. You talk about dependence. And, it's so important to ensure that people are welcome, that they're made productive. I can give an example from our academy schools. We run 38 academies across some of the most economically challenged parts of the country. Many of those students are children of immigrants. And in that sort of positive environment where people get a good education, they are allowed to prosper and they are sent out into the world. We have just 2.1% of our secondary school leavers who are not employed or going into further education, and that's 5.9% lower than the national average. So I do think as an employer, we do need those skills, but we also need to create an environment where they can prosper.
But are you recruiting from abroad because you're worried about the skills of people who are already here?
We're not recruiting from abroad. What we are doing is we are recruiting people who are already in this country that we need the skill sets of.
I just want to say that, again, to go back to that June 2023 figure, 179,000 of that figure were children. So Britain has to educate them. That's fine. I don't want to deprive someone of the right to bring their children. I don't want to split up families. But that is one of the costs of mass migration. People bring dependents, and then the host country has to pay money to educate them. It is not the economic boom and driver.
So there is a cost to immigration. Do you accept that?
Well, there's gains as well, and it's all about getting the balance right. And I think, we've just heard some fantastic examples around the input we're able to provide to then see that longer term benefit that we will gain. So we've got to look at this in a long way. We've also got to accept that the kind of geopolitics of this world are changing rapidly, and whether it's through climate or conflict, and we've got to be at that table, that top table, leading the discussion about how we're going to, as nations, start looking at the mass migration of individuals, because people literally cannot grow crops. They're being flooded and there's famine. We've got to address those issues as well. We know most displacement is internal within other countries, but there are times when international countries, like in the Ukraine situation, are called upon to provide support. We need better planning for those events when they do occur.
The Reform UK leader, Nigel Farage, has been speaking this morning, holding a press conference. Let's have a listen to what he's had to say.
So let's get it into our heads. In 2023, under a Conservative government, nearly 1 million net people came into our country. This after manifestos in 2010, 2015, 2017 and 2019, promising in the first three they'd reduce the numbers to tens of thousands a year, and in the last one, a substantial reduction. I have had enough of being lied to by the Conservative Party. I don't believe they'll be forgiven at any point in the next few years for what they have done and the impact it's had on people's lives.
And Neil, surely your party does have to think about that. There's a question of trust here, isn't there? Having made these promises, and those targets haven't just been missed, they've been spectacularly missed, and people don't believe anything you say anymore.
And I don't shy away from that. That is an issue that we face as a party. We found that to our detriment at the recent general election, and it was an issue that Kemi faced head-on yesterday by admitting that we hadn't delivered on those promises, and it had led to a lack of trust in us as a political party. We need to regain that trust, and we do that, as I said earlier, by developing a raft of policies, well thought through and judged policies, to deliver on this. But it's very easy for Nigel Farage to criticise things from the fringes. I have to say I take his interventions with an increasing pinch of salt these days, given his lack of engagement in the parliamentary process, which he was elected.
But nevertheless, millions of people did vote for reform at the last election. And one of your former colleagues, he's announced today, Andrea Jenkins, the former Conservative MP, has defected to Reform UK. Are you worried about that threat from his party? You can see her here now greeting Nigel Farage. She has joined Reform UK. What do you make of that?
I think in Andrea's case, that was a journey that she's been on for some time. My focus is on supporting our candidate when they're chosen in Lincolnshire in the mayoral elections and getting Conservative mayors elected up and down the country. But of course, we can't neglect the 4 million people who voted for reform at the last election, many of whom did so in frustration with what they thought were the failures of mainstream political parties. So we do need to go and regain their trust and confidence. That's absolutely certain.
And Tim, this is going to continue to be a political issue, isn't it?
Yes, of course it is. And the interesting question is, what is going to be Labour's deal for solving this? And I come back to, I think there is a socialist solution to the problem of mass migration, which is unionisation and paying British workers better salaries. It doesn't just have to be driven by clamping down. It can also be done by upskilling and improving the deal for British workers, such that there is no need to import large numbers of people. We should have a thriving social care sector. Social care is good, moral work. It should be well paid, and governments should be working with business to ensure that British people want to go into it, because there are a lot of people right now out of work who would benefit from that work.
Let's move on to talk about the budget, the fallout from the budget, which is continuing. And we can have a listen to the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. She was speaking earlier this week at the Confederation of British Industry, their conference on Monday. And this is what she had to say.
I faced a problem and I faced into it. And we've now drawn a line under the fiction peddled by the previous government. We've put our public finances back on a firm footing, and we've now set the budgets for public services for the duration of this Parliament. Public services now need to live within their means, because I'm really clear, I'm not coming back with more borrowing or more taxes.
Now, that was, of course, on the back of a big rise in employer national insurance. There's been a certain amount of unhappiness, presumably in the audience there that Rachel Reeves was talking to. Let's speak now to Gemma Tetlow, who is the Chief Economist at the Institute for Government. And Gemma, what's your assessment of what the Chancellor had to say there, suggesting that there will be no further tax rises, presumably for the rest of this Parliament?
That is quite a big claim to make at this point. And I think because if you look at the budget plans, there were two quite big gambles baked into the plans that they set out. One was that in terms of complying with the fiscal rules that they've chosen, Rachel Reeves left herself very little headroom, so she has just £10 billion of headroom against her objective that taxes should be enough to cover day-to-day public spending within 5 years. That may sound a big number, but actually in the context of public finances, that you could easily have some slightly bad economic news that pushes you off on that.
And do you think it is remotely achievable politically to deliver this, given, as you say there, that when it comes to public spending, government departments, this presumably would mean that they would be having quite a tight budget towards the end of this Parliament?
On the public spending plans, Rachel Reeves announced a big injection of cash for public services this year and next year. But then if we look for the following 3 years, where we're going to get the detail of that in next year's spending review, the rate of growth of spending over those 3 years looks really quite low. And particularly if you think that departments like the NHS are going to get increases, you could see needing to find real terms cuts to other areas of public spending. So they've sort of made a gamble on hoping that money up front and some sort of bigger injections into capital spending will be enough to mean that they can spend a relatively little amount on day-to-day spending over the rest of the Parliament. And that, I think, is going to be difficult to achieve.
And it is worth pointing out that there are tax rises in the sense that Rachel Reeves is continuing to freeze the thresholds, isn't she, on income tax, for example?
Yes, so her plans are predicated on freezing income tax thresholds and, importantly, increasing fuel duty from April 2026 onwards, which is obviously something that no Chancellor has managed to do since 2011, and Rachel Reeves has put off for 1 year already.
OK, Gemma, thank you very much indeed for that context. Now, Rachel, I mean, what do you make of this? If we take this at face value, what Rachel Reeves is saying, it's going to mean spending cuts in government departments, isn't it? Are you comfortable with that?
Well, it's been a very difficult start, and let's remember why we're in this position. We've had 14 years of profligacy by a government, and in particular, 2 years ago, we were in an economic situation caused by that mini budget, and we're still paying the cost for that. But when opening the books, seeing that many of those accounts were just not accurate, things committed, not paid for, but also money missing.
Although there were plenty of people telling us that actually a lot of the spending plans were a work of fiction.
Well, and we discovered
on both sides.
And we discovered that in July, and that's why some immediate measures needed to be put in place. We understand that this is the first budget to start building that stability for the long term, and we've got to remember we're not just looking at the start-stop economy, which we've seen over the last 10, 15 years. We are really now focusing about the long-term provision that we need to make those investments in public services, which isn't always about more money. It's about a realignment of services as well.
So for 2 years there will be some more money, but after that it's going to be pretty difficult. So you're saying that reform can do the job?
Well, we've got the National Wealth Fund as well, so that it will bring real growth across business and investment. So this is about getting money in the right places and then being able to see that flourish. So we've got to set out in the spring the comprehensive spending review that will then obviously determine the direction for the government and how it will invest in those services for the long term. So we're in the first stages of a process, and we've got to remember when Labour was last in government, we had those first 2 years where we were just building that stability again to then see the incredible things that we were able to achieve.
But are you concerned that the Chancellor's effectively boxed the government in here, that this might be a promise that she can't keep?
Well, I think we have to look at the whole taxation system. We know that the burden of tax now is put on income as opposed to on wealth. So having that longer-term plan to ensure that there's greater equality...
Doesn't sound like she's going to do that, though.
Well, she needs to build the programme. So let's give that capacity. She's only been there for 5 months. Let's give that capacity to look at how we get greater equality across our economy and ensure that those with the broader shoulders do contribute the most. And that's not happening at the moment.
OK, when it comes to business, the CBI, there obviously lots in the audience weren't happy with the budget. There's been a lot of talk from the government about growth, and yet many would argue that this wasn't a growth budget. It wasn't helping employers. What impact is the budget going to have on your company, particularly given that you employ 55,000 staff?
Yeah, so I think it's important to give some context in our organisation. We are a cooperative that's owned by 6.1 million members. As you said, we have 55,000 employees. 54,000 of those are members as well. So they also own our organisation. Now, if we look at what's happened with the real living wage since 2023 and looking forward to 2025, there have been significant increases. And to the co-op alone, that's 160 million that we have found to be able to finance those. However, when you look at the actual real income to employees, because inflation has outpaced that real living wage increase, people are actually earning less. So I understand why the Chancellor did not want to take a hit against workers.
But the national insurance rise, presumably, is going to... Are you going to be passing that on to customers, or is it going to mean not as high a pay rise
so the national
those who
insurance
work for you?
rise will be in the tens of millions of pounds for us. Business rates also, you know, we've seen a 20% increase over the last 2 years. So that's taken our business rate bill to 111 million. But I think the important thing for us is we want to look at the entire budget in the round. So there have been some positive, there's been some positive news on business rates, especially for high street stores, which we believe are critical to communities. So we want to see what the impact is on that, and we want to work with government on ensuring that we get that right. And also there has been additional funding into things like retail crime. For us, that's an £80 million hit in this year. If we can get policing...
Is that on the rise?
It's on the rise. Absolutely, it's on the rise. And it's not people who are stealing to feed their families. This is organized crime that is hitting our stores. And there's violence against our colleagues as well. So if we can get the policing right, if we can ensure that that £200 limit is eliminated so that we can actually prosecute people in the way that the government promises, there'll be a positive effect of that as well. So from a co-op perspective, we're not jumping up and down about it. We want to see the full picture because there are hits to our business, but there could also be benefits. And we'll make the decision from there. The last thing I'll say is we will be looking for operational efficiencies for a long time before we even think about prices.
OK. Tim, what Rachel Reeves said there, it does sound rather that she's boxed herself in. Do you believe her?
I think she looks nervous. I really do.
Do you think she misspoke?
I'm surprised. No, I'm surprised she said it. I was in the audience, and I was surprised she said it because the government has made a big play of we're making the tough decisions now. We're a tough government. It's odd to say that and then say, but in the future, we won't be so tough.
Had she been getting quite a hard time in the run-up to this comment from the audience?
Because she's getting it from the farmers over inheritance tax. She's getting it from big businesses saying we may have to cease hiring or lay people off. It's true, she's tried to, one should say she's tried to balance the hit to business upon big business. I mean, small businesses still get some rebates. There's a doubling of what they can, of the threshold at which they have to pay, etc., which means that they're let off relatively lightly. But the point is the government is gambling everything on growth. You talk about that 10 billion headroom. Well, in the years to come, That headroom is going to be dependent upon the ability of the British economy to grow. And to do so many things at once, to say we're going to try and balance the books, we're going to try and put people back into work, we're going to try and grow, we're going to try and increase tax money to the Treasury, while also adopting policies which potentially discourage people from hiring or from opening new stores, there's a tension there. So the signal she's trying to send to business is, that's it, the tough stuff is all done, and from now on you just go away and you grow, because we've produced the stability, we've balanced the books, you just go away and grow. But I worry that businesses are still going to be living with the consequences of those quote-unquote tough decisions, which will discourage them from making investments, because who right now, looking at the amount of tax they have to pay, the changes are coming down from Angela Rayner and the employment law, who right now would take a punt on opening a business?
Rachel, it is a problem, isn't it? If the government has talked a lot about growth, and yet this is potentially discouraging growth.
Well, we need to understand what we're talking about when we say growth as well, because when we're talking about making 2.8 million people who are not economic at the moment, bringing them back into the workforce, giving them the dignity of work, then that's going to be far more productive. So, of course, there are those opportunities, and we know that people will now have more money in their pockets because of the rise in the minimum wage. That means they will spend in the local economy and help those local businesses. So we've got to look longer term and not just at the immediate impact. And I think what we will see, and I'm very proud with having Shireen here as well, because we're going to say we're going to double the size of the cooperatives, which really will have a different model of business in the future, much more sustainable as well.
Neil, when it comes to the Conservatives, obviously you say you don't want these tax rises, you're against them, but your plans were called a work of fiction as well by independent economists, especially when it comes to public services and funding for public services. What would your plan be for the NHS, for example, for education?
Well, what we've said about the NHS, and there's a point of cause in terms of the pay rises that were given to junior doctors. They've come without any reform, and we have to have productivity reform in these large organisations.
But you were in power for several years, and did that happen?
Well, there were challenges around COVID, for example, which put huge pressures on the system. But looking forward, we can't, and we put record investment into the NHS. We did put record levels of investment into the NHS. But it's not just about putting money into the system. It's about making sure the system is operating in a way that that money is spent efficiently and effectively to get better outcomes for patients. So to put more money in, as the government has proposed to do, to give inflation rising, busting pay rises to junior doctors without any reform to productivity is a wrong signal. In my view, it's a wrong way of dealing with things, and it's not one that would be supported by the private sector.
Okay.
Can I add something just on doubling the cooperative sector? You mentioned social care and the challenges around it. We've done quite a lot of research on social care, and there are countries who are actually doing very well, and they're doing it through the cooperative model, in that the money that is paid by the person accessing it either gets funneled back into the business or it gets invested back into the communities that they serve. So it is about fixing, I think, the public services and making sure they're more efficient, but also looking at different models that may work elsewhere that could also work in our country.
Okay. Let's move on now to tomorrow and look ahead to what could be an historic vote in the House of Commons on assisted dying. MPs will vote on the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill for England and Wales, which, if passed, it would give people in certain circumstances the right to die at a time of their choosing. Now, we're joined by Elise Burns. For many people, for MPs, this is a matter of conscience, and of course, for lots of people, this is a very personal issue. And Elise is joining us to tell us about her circumstances. And Elise, you are in favour of this bill. Can you tell us why?
Hi, Vicky. Thanks for having me. Yes, I'm absolutely in favour of this. I am very recently diagnosed with secondary cancer of the lungs, liver and bones. So that is to say I have terminal cancer, and I think, my prognosis, people are very reluctant to give me a prognosis, but I think we're probably looking at 2 years. The median for people with my condition is 2 years. So yes, I very, very much support this. I think sadly, even if the bill, if the vote goes through tomorrow, obviously it's a very long process, so it may not be in time for me, but here on behalf of everyone, the thousands of people that will be affected and their families going forward if this vote goes through tomorrow.
There are many people in your circumstances who do feel the same way. They feel that they should have this choice. There are lots of people who say that they are concerned about those who might be coerced into making this decision, maybe by family, maybe by friends. What do you say to those who make that argument?
I say respectfully that as the law as it stands is not fit for purpose, and there is absolutely no protection for people in my situation. So this will bake in protection. I think there's going to be, law punishable by up to 14 years imprisonment for coercion. I would also say that the medical profession are assessing coercion as part of their daily job, on a day-to-day basis, whether it's refusing treatment, whether it's going into care home, that sort of thing. So I think I refute it.
OK, Elise, thank you very much for joining us with your story. This is an incredibly personal issue. I think tomorrow, actually, the debate probably will have a lot of people's personal experiences. How will you be voting tomorrow, Neil?
First of all, I'd just like to pay tribute to Elise because I thought her words were very powerful there. Wherever you sit on the debate, it's really important to hear the voices of those who will be directly affected by what goes on in Parliament tomorrow. I've been quite public on where I'm sat with this. I'm going to vote in favour of the proposed legislation. But I think whatever takes place tomorrow, it's really important we have that debate in a very respectful way. That I've said this before, there are no right or wrong answers to this. This is a personal view that we will have all reached for a variety of reasons. And
why have you come to that view? You have a medical background, don't you?
I do. So I think in part from personal experiences and my experiences working in the healthcare sector, seeing, despite the best efforts of palliative care, and this is not a binary issue between improving palliative care in this country and offering the choice of assisted dying. But despite the best efforts, I have been there, and it's a very personal moment when somebody dies and seen them dying in pain. And you feel helpless as a clinician in terms of supporting them through that process. But I've also spoken with many of my constituents on both sides of the debate. And I feel that there is a shift in society since this was last debated in Parliament. There is, in my constituency, 75% support for a change in the law. I feel we've reached that tipping point, and this particular piece of legislation, as it's drafted, does differ from those that have come before. We've got the safeguarding mechanisms which are more robust than they have been before in terms of 2 doctors and oversight of a judge, but also it brings those safeguards before the act of death opposed to afterwards.
OK, Rachel, you're against this bill. What do you say to that argument that people shouldn't be allowed to die in pain? If they want to end their own lives, they should be helped to do that?
Well, first of all, I've listened really intensely to my constituents over this issue on both sides of the argument, and I think it's really important to state that. But I am really concerned about the safeguards. First of all, we know that many people who have been campaigning for assisted dying won't qualify. In fact, over half the people already who go to Dignitas, this will not be a solution for them.
But that's because it's been drawn quite tightly, hasn't it, for that reason? And the Kim Leadbeater would say that is why she's done that. It is quite restricted.
It is in one way, but not in others. So to prognosticate at 6 months, doctors say it's very difficult, 46% accuracy at that point, yet a major component of the bill. And then when we move over to look at the issue of coercion, whilst there may be malign coercion, we know that happens across our society in so many places we think about. We're just learning about what's going on in relationships in our country, let alone with elder abuse. And then I look particularly, as my experience as a clinician, around that internal coercion where individuals just don't want to be a burden or are worried about the cost of social care, thinking money could be better spent on their children. And if people are feeling coerced, they may talk themselves into having an assisted death. And therefore, I don't believe those safeguards are robust. We look at what's happening at the moment in the discussion in the Isle of Man, where they're talking about perhaps something more akin to a parole board, looking at instead we're seeing individual doctors on their own, having a discussion. There's nothing safe about that, not least with their unconscious bias, which we know is prevalent in healthcare.
Okay, Shireen.
I want to give a personal view on this. First of all, I'm glad that MPs are not being encouraged on which direction to vote,
It's
that
a free
they're
vote,
able to
yeah.
consult and make that decision. I watched my aunt die over a period of 4 years. And she was diagnosed with a terminal illness that she knew was going to result in extreme pain, dementia, and suffering. And she was a devout Christian. And she told me when she was suffering, before she had dementia, that she wanted to die. She didn't want to go through what was happening next. And she experienced horrific pain and loss of her consciousness and loss of her personality. And there was nothing that we could do to help her. And I was with her when she died. I wouldn't wish that on anyone.
So that is the issue, Tim, isn't it? That palliative care doesn't work for lots of people.
This is a very emotive debate. I'm sorry to hear that. That's very sad. First of all, the bill has not been given enough time. The idea that
but it will get more time if MPs were to go through second reading.
I know, but there are, for example, no limits on speech time. So the idea that this could be dominated by a handful of speeches done in one Friday afternoon when we're talking about shifting the whole ethics of medical care in this country is just absurd. The bill, as Rachel has said, does have problems with it, with regards coercion, things like whether or not the doctor will be in the room with the person when they take the medicine at the end of their life, things like that. There are serious flaws with the bill. But one thing that's fascinated me is that I thought this would boil down to a debate about ethics and religion. And partly because it's a Labour majority, it's become about something else, which is poverty and inequality. If you accept the argument, which I think is true, that this is a very poor country with a health service on its knees, you have to ask yourself, can we give people seriously a choice between good quality palliative care and feeling that they ought to make the choice to take their own life?
It isn't a binary choice necessarily, is it? Why can't you have both?
Because we don't have both. And so many Labour MPs who I think if they had a straightforward ethical debate might be sympathetic towards assisted dying will instead vote against it because they know that we're not in the position to offer a good alternative. And for instance, my mother lives with long-term pain, and I'm going to be upset talking about it as well. The service she gets is so bad. And just getting a letter written to get you referred. My mother was in crippling pain, and she had to wait 2 weeks to wait to be referred. Now, if our service is not capable...
But you are against this on principle as well, aren't you?
But
you're not saying if
pain,
the NHS was working
if you said to someone who's in
properly,
pain, we can't guarantee you good treatment. We can't guarantee you good, speedy treatment. That person's going to choose because my mother feels suicidal.
Aren't these two different topics, though? One is about palliative care and being able to provide people with the best possible care at the time that they really need it. The other is, no matter how good the care is, the person's in pain. The person's going to go, they're upset, and they know that there's years of this coming.
And in an ideal world, but in an ideal world, yes, that's the condition under which we would have this debate. But that's not the way things are. And the reality is that the end of life it can be so full of pain and so full of suffering. The idea that we can make a clinical, rational decision in every single case, and there'll never be abuse, and that person will never feel pressured, and there'll never be coercion. Ultimately, you're asking us, should the state be involved in the taking of life? That's the question we're asking.
Neil,
and if there is any risk at someone being killed wrongly, then we have to be cautious and say no.
Neil?
No, and I am sympathetic to the arguments that have been put forward, but I don't see this as the state being involved in death. It's about taking of life. It's about shortening death. It's about shortening death when people are in acute and extremist pain. And as Shireen's pointed out, palliative care, despite its best efforts, cannot always alleviate that. This is about a freedom of choice from my perspective, of having individuals to make the choice and have that final autonomy over their own body at the end of their life.
Okay, thank you very much to all of my panel. This kind of debate is going to continue tomorrow. There's going to be several hours in the House of Commons. If you'd like to hear more of that, it will be shown in full on BBC Parliament on TV and the iPlayer tomorrow from 9:30 in the morning. Goodbye.